and in Europe. So the future of our economies depends on a fair and on reliable supply chain.
I don't arrive in Bamako or Ouagadougou or Niamey with demands saying you have to do this or you have to do that. What I do arrive with is the availability to listen and also the availability to say, my friends, you know, there are some impediments here for us in terms of working together. So let's see how we can go through those impediments. I want to arrive saying, let us try to work out what it is possible for us to do without, of course, compromising our values that are very important for us and for our populations.
The wealth of Africa belongs to Africans. The mineral wealth that is beneath the soil of Africa must, in the end, accrue to Africans.
Europe's factories aren't slowing because of energy or labor. They're slowing because something far more basic is running out. Minerals, the same minerals needed for electric cars, wind turbines, batteries, and digital infrastructure. And Europe doesn't have them, Africa does. For decades, access was assumed. Now it has to be negotiated. And every delay, every stalled project, every rising cost points to the same reality. Europe's future runs through African soil. This isn't about charity or development aid anymore. It's about survival. And for the first time, Africa isn't just supplying the world's ambitions, it's deciding how far they go. The realization did not arrive as a single announcement or crisis meeting. It emerged slowly through supply reports, factory slowdowns, delayed projects, and internal assessments that no longer aligned with public optimism. Europe had built its industrial future on assumptions that no longer held, and at the center of that unraveling was a dependency it had long underestimated: Africa's minerals. For decades, Europe treated mineral access as a technical matter rather than a strategic one. Raw materials arrived through global markets, processed through established routes, priced through predictable mechanisms. The system appeared resilient because it had never been seriously tested. Africa supplied, Europe transformed, and value flowed upward along familiar lines. That balance has shifted. Europe's green transition accelerated faster than its resource strategy. Electric vehicles, renewable energy grids, advanced manufacturing, and digital infrastructure all demanded inputs that Europe did not possess in sufficient quantities. Lithium, cobalt, manganese, rare earth elements, copper, and platinum group metals moved from obscure line items to critical bottlenecks. Each new policy goal tightened the constraint. Africa sat at the center of that equation. Countries across the continent controlled a significant share of the minerals Europe now classified as essential. What had once been treated as interchangeable commodities were suddenly strategic assets, and Africa was no longer willing to play the same role it had in the past. The shift began with awareness. African governments examined export data and recognized a pattern. Raw materials left cheaply, returned expensively, and generated limited domestic value. This was not new knowledge, but timing mattered. Global demand surged precisely as Africa's internal confidence grew. That convergence created leverage. Europe, meanwhile, faced narrowing options. Domestic mining projects encountered regulatory resistance and high costs. Alternative suppliers were limited, politically unstable, or already tied into long-term agreements elsewhere. Recycling offered partial relief but could not meet demand at scale. Substitution technologies remained years away from commercial viability. Africa was not just the most viable option. It was the only one capable of meeting scale, diversity, and growth simultaneously. Negotiations reflected this reality. African countries no longer accepted extraction-only agreements. Processing requirements appeared in contracts. Local employment clauses expanded. Infrastructure commitments became standard. Payment structures adjusted to reflect long-term partnership rather than spot market access. Europe found itself negotiating from a position it was unaccustomed to. Urgency replaced confidence. Timelines tightened. Flexibility increased. What had once been framed as development assistance now reappeared as strategic cooperation. Language shifted accordingly. Africa noticed Mineral-rich countries coordinated policies to avoid undercutting each other. Export controls were refined, licensing regimes strengthened, data transparency improved. These were not acts of hostility, they were acts of consolidation. Europe's industries felt the effects first. Battery manufacturers struggled to secure inputs, automotive. Timelines slipped, renewable energy projects faced cost overruns. Strategic autonomy, once a political slogan, became an operational challenge. The contradiction grew sharper. Europe wanted independence from external shocks, yet its transition deepened reliance on external resources. The only question was whether that reliance would be managed or imposed. Africa chose to manage it. By retaining more stages of the value chain, African countries reduced exposure to price volatility and increased bargaining power. Processing facilities anchored minerals domestically, skills developed, industrial ecosystems began to form around what had once been isolated extraction sites. Europe could not ignore this transformation. Supply security now depended not just on access, but on alignment. Contracts required trust. Trust required reciprocity. Reciprocity required adjustment. The old model no longer worked. Africa was not blocking exports. It was redefining terms. That distinction mattered. It allowed Africa to assert control without triggering confrontation. It reframed negotiations as modernization rather than resistance. Europe adapted, but unevenly. Some countries moved quickly, embracing joint ventures, technology transfer, and long-term commitments. Others hesitated, hoping markets would correct themselves. That divergence created internal tension within Europe itself, as industries competed for priority access. Africa observed carefully. Selective partnerships emerged. Countries that offered integration gained favor. Those that insisted on extraction-only models faced delays. The message was consistent even when unstated. Access was no longer automatic. This was the point at which desperation entered quietly, not in rhetoric but in behavior. Europe extended timelines, adjusted standards, offered concessions previously considered unnecessary. The balance of initiative had shifted. Africa did not rush. Having waited decades for favorable terms, it now exercised patience. Demand growth worked in its favor. Every year of delay increased leverage. Every new technology announcement reinforced dependency. Europe's survival narrative hardened. Without stable mineral access, industrial competitiveness faltered. Without competitiveness, employment suffered. Without employment, political cohesion weakened. Minerals became a foundational issue, not a sectoral one. Africa understood the stakes. This was not about revenge or reversal. It was about recalibration. Africa sought a future where its resources supported its development as much as they supported others' transitions. Europe needed Africa not as a supplier, but as a partner. That realization marked the true shift. Dependency had always existed. What changed was acknowledgement. Europe could no longer pretend that its green and digital ambitions were achievable without Africa's consent, cooperation, and participation. The minerals beneath African soil were no longer silent contributors to distant prosperity. They had become central to Europe's survival. Europe's dependence unfolded not through public declarations but through operational stress. Once the scale of mineral demand became unavoidable, the abstract language of strategy gave way to concrete constraints. Projects stalled, supply forecasts tightened, risk models began to flag Africa not as an external variable but as a central determinant of Europe's industrial future. Europe's manufacturers adjusted procurement strategies first. Long-term contracts replaced short-term sourcing. Price ceilings disappeared from negotiations. Flexibility increased where rigidity had once defined leverage. African suppliers were no longer treated as interchangeable nodes in a global chain. They became gatekeepers. This change reshaped internal European politics. Countries with stronger diplomatic and commercial ties to Africa gained advantages. Those that lagged faced shortages sooner. Competition emerged not just between firms, but between states. Coordination within Europe strained under asymmetric access. Africa observed these dynamics with clarity. Rather than exploit divisions openly, African countries focused on standardizing their own positions. Regional cooperation intensified around mineral policy. Export frameworks aligned, environmental and labor standards were harmonized to strengthen credibility and reduce vulnerability to pressure. This unity amplified bargaining power. Europe's private sector adapted faster than its public institutions. Companies pursued joint ventures, invested in local processing, and accepted equity sharing arrangements that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Control gave way to participation. Governments followed cautiously. Strategic dialogues expanded, infrastructure financing reappeared under new labels, technology sharing provisions softened, Europe reframed engagement as partnership, but the urgency behind the language was evident. Africa's leverage extended beyond minerals themselves. Control over processing locations influenced logistics routes, energy planning, and workforce development. Decisions made in African capitals affected timelines in European industrial zones. The dependency became systemic. Europe's green transition exposed a paradox. In seeking independence from fossil fuels and geopolitical risk, it had increased reliance on materials concentrated elsewhere. Africa, with its abundance, occupied a position no policy adjustment could bypass. This forced re-evaluation of assumptions, efficiency gave way to resilience as a guiding principle, redundancy replaced optimization. Yet even with diversification efforts, Africa remained irreplaceable in the medium term. Africa used this window strategically. Rather than maximizing short-term gains, countries prioritized institutional strength. Licensing processes improved, revenue management frameworks matured, industrial planning integrated mineral policy with broader development goals. The aim was permanence, not extraction. Europe's industries began factoring African policy stability into investment decisions. Predictability mattered more than price. African countries that demonstrated coherence attracted deeper engagement. This reversed historical patterns. Stability had once been demanded of Africa by external partners. Now Africa demanded reliability from those seeking access. The psychological shift was profound. Africa was no longer negotiating from a position of need. It negotiated from a position of relevance. Europe's survival narratives reinforced this reality daily. Technological innovation did not offer immediate relief. Substitution materials remained limited. Recycling expanded but could not scale fast enough. New mining projects outside Africa faced environmental and social resistance. Time favored Africa's position. Europe adapted. Incrementally, educational partnerships expanded to train African engineers. Research collaboration focused on local processing efficiency. Supply security became inseparable from African development outcomes. This alignment altered incentives. Supporting African industrialization was no longer framed as altruism. It became self-interest. Europe's survival depended on Africa's capacity to produce, process, and regulate responsibly. Africa recognized the shift. Engagement became more selective. Countries prioritized partners willing to invest in ecosystems rather than extract outputs. Trust became the currency of access. Europe's desperation remained controlled but visible. Deadlines slipped, costs rose, political pressure mounted internally. The mineral question became a test of Europe's ability to operate in a multipolar world where control was replaced by negotiation. Africa did not seek dominance. It sought balance. By asserting agency over its resources, Africa redefined the terms of global industrial cooperation. Europe's need made that redefinition unavoidable. The outcome was not collapse, but transformation. Europe adjusted to a reality where survival depended on partnership rather than privilege. Africa stepped into a role long denied to it, co-author of the global industrial future. The minerals beneath African soil had always mattered. What changed was who decided how they would shape the world.